And the U.S. Secretary of State says Israel has an obligation to minimize civilian casualties in Gaza. Antony Blinken made those comments at his end-of-year press conference and said Washington will focus on bringing the war to an end as quickly as possible.
We continue to believe that Israel does not have to choose between removing the threat of Hamas and minimizing the toll on civilians in Gaza. It has an obligation to do both, and it has a strategic interest to do both. We're more determined than ever to ensure that out of this horrific tragedy comes a moment of possibility for Israelis, for Palestinians, for the region, to live in lasting peace and lasting security. That out of this darkness comes light.
Let's bring in Mike Hanna. He's joining us live from Washington, D.C. And what else did we hear from Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Mike? He was also asked about what it would take for the U.S. to stop vetoing resolutions at the UN Security Council, wasn't he?
Yes, he was, and he didn't answer that question directly. He went on to say that the latest resolution, which has now been put on hold again, deals with humanitarian affairs, and the U.S. is insistent that it doesn't want any resolution passed that will not help the provision of humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. So he didn't answer that question directly, just as he didn't answer a question which was put to him directly: does the U.S. have a red line when it comes to the manner of Israel's operations in Gaza and the occupied West Bank? Once again, he didn't answer that directly. He continued to say what has been the line offered by the Biden administration, that Israel has a right and indeed duty to take operations against Hamas. At the same time, it has a right and a strategic duty to be able to minimize the cost of civilian casualties. He described this as vitally important, how Israel conducts its operations. So the Secretary of State, like the Biden administration, walking the thin line here, attempting to show that it cares about civilian casualties and is indeed deeply concerned about them, at the same time wanting to publicly back Israel in its ongoing operations. Just to add, the Secretary of State also spoke about over the year, the U.S. has strengthened its alliances throughout the globe with its partner organizations. However, another question that he would not answer is to what extent the U.S. ongoing, unquestioning support of Israel is impacting on these global alliances.
And Mike, we've also heard from President Biden, who's been speaking. What has he had to say?
Well, we heard from President Biden on the subject of a Colorado Supreme Court decision, in terms of which it ruled on an unprecedented basis that former President Trump cannot stand on the ballot in Colorado because of an 1868 resolution, in terms of which anybody who takes part in acts of insurrection cannot hold an elected office. Now, President Biden was asked about this. First of all, he said, yes, he has no doubt that Donald Trump took part in an insurrection. However, on the issue as to whether this should disqualify him from standing in the Colorado ballot, that, said President Biden, is something that's up for the courts to decide. He didn't want to get caught in the legalese of this argument, which very clearly is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court, which, just to add, the Supreme Court has already accepted a brief from the special prosecutor investigating Donald Biden in terms of Donald Trump, in terms of ruling on the question of his immunity. Now, this is in regard to another case, but clearly it has to do with the Colorado case as well. First of all, the level of insurrection, whether it can be applied against Donald Trump. Secondly, the question of whether there is any presidential immunity for President Trump for acts he did while in office. So, in all likelihood, we are going to see a U.S. Supreme Court maybe binding these two matters together and ruling, and it does appear as a matter of urgency, ruling on both matters, immunity and whether or not Donald Trump can be kicked off that Colorado ballot at the same time.
All right, Mike, thank you very much for that. Mike Hanna with the latest on both of those stories, live in Washington, D.C.